For most of the past century, if you asked where our species began, you would have received a remarkably confident answer. East Africa, the Rift Valley. A single specific cradle of humankind, usually pointed to somewhere around modern-day Ethiopia, Kenya, or Tanzania, where legendary fossil discoveries like Lucy the Australopithecine captured public imagination and anchored decades of textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits around one clean, tidy origin story. That story felt satisfying precisely because it was simple. One region, one birthplace, one clear starting point for the entire human journey that eventually spread across the globe. Increasingly, however, a growing body of genetic and fossil evidence suggests that this tidy, single-origin story may never have been accurate at all, and that the true picture of where and how our species actually began is considerably messier, considerably more distributed, and in many ways considerably more interesting than the version most of us grew up learning. To understand why this shift matters so significantly, it helps to first understand exactly how confidently the East Africa narrative became embedded within both scientific and popular understanding throughout the 20th century. Beginning with Louis and Mary Leakey's influential excavations at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania during the 1950s and 60s, and continuing through the discovery of Lucy in Ethiopia during the 1970s, East Africa produced an extraordinary and genuinely remarkable concentration of early hominin fossils, spanning millions of years of evolutionary history. Given the sheer density and quality of these discoveries, it became scientifically reasonable, and eventually almost automatic, for researchers to treat East Africa as the singular birthplace of humanity, with other African regions treated largely as secondary or peripheral to the main evolutionary story, unfolding specifically within the Rift Valley. If you enjoy watching long-accepted scientific narratives get carefully re-examined and rebuilt from the ground up, go ahead and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep making more content exactly like this. But there was always a quieter problem lurking underneath this tidy narrative, one that took decades for the wider field to fully reckon with. Fossilization is an extraordinarily rare and geologically selective process requiring very specific environmental conditions, like the right kind of sediment, the right chemistry, and long-term geological stability, in order for ancient bone to be preserved and eventually discovered by researchers millions of years later. East Africa's Rift Valley happens to offer almost uniquely favorable conditions for this kind of fossil preservation, thanks to its active volcanic geology, which conveniently interlayers datable volcanic ash with fossil-bearing sediment. This means the extraordinary concentration of East African fossils may reflect, at least in significant part, exactly where fossils happen to survive and later be found by researchers, rather than necessarily reflecting exactly where the most important evolutionary developments were actually taking place across the broader African continent. Other regions across Africa, by contrast, all conditions for fossil preservation, meaning that even if significant hominin populations lived, evolved, and interacted across those regions for enormous stretches of time, the physical evidence of their existence may have simply failed to survive long enough to be discovered today, or may still be sitting undiscovered beneath terrain that has not yet been extensively excavated by researchers. In other words, an absence of fossil evidence from a given region does not necessarily mean an absence of ancient human populations living there. It may simply mean the conditions never existed to preserve and later reveal that evidence in the first place. This growing awareness of fossilization bias has combined powerfully with a series of major discoveries elsewhere across Africa that directly challenge the East Africa exclusive narrative. Perhaps the most significant single finding came from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, located in North Africa, thousands of kilometers away from the traditionally emphasized East African fossil sites. Fossils originally excavated at this site during the 1960s had long been mistakenly classified as a relatively recent population, roughly 40,000 years old. But a thorough reanalysis published in the year 2017, using considerably more advanced dating techniques than had been available during the original excavation, revealed something startling. These fossils were not 40,000 years old at all. They were roughly 300,000 years old, representing some of the earliest confirmed Homo sapiens remains ever discovered anywhere on the planet, and pushing the known origin of our species back by more than 100,000 years compared to the previously accepted timeline. Just as significantly, these fossils were found not in East Africa, but in Morocco, at the opposite end of the African continent entirely. This single discovery, on its own, forced researchers to seriously reconsider whether, at a considerably earlier date than the traditional East Africa-centered narrative had ever comfortably allowed for. If uncovering the way genuinely major scientific discoveries can quietly overturn decades of settled consensus fascinates you, make sure you are subscribed, because there's a great deal more of this kind of deep scientific detective work still waiting to be explored on this channel. Genetic research examining the DNA of contemporary African populations has added a further independently derived layer of support to this broader reconsideration. Rather than showing a single, clean genetic lineage, tracing back to one specific region, researchers studying deep population structure across Africa have increasingly identified evidence suggesting that early Homo sapiens existed as a patchwork of semi-isolated regional populations, scattered across various parts of the continent, that periodically came into contact with one another, exchanged genetic material, separated again for extended periods, and then sometimes reconnected once more, repeating this pattern of separation and remixing across many thousands of years. This model, sometimes referred to among researchers as African multi-regionalism, or a Pan-African origin model, suggests that modern humanity did not emerge from one single population in one specific location, but instead gradually coalesced from multiple interconnected populations spread across a much wider swath of the African continent, each contributing genetic material to what eventually became modern Homo sapiens. A particularly striking and admittedly more controversial proposal along these lines emerged from a 2019 study focused specifically on the Kalahari region of southern Africa, examining mitochondrial DNA lineages among contemporary populations. Researchers involved in that study proposed the ancient Makgadikgadi wetland system, located in what is now Botswana, as a possible specific homeland for the earliest population of anatomically modern humans, citing deep mitochondrial lineage patterns among populations connected to that region. This particular proposal generated considerable pushback from other researchers within the field, many of whom argued that mitochondrial DNA alone, representing only a single maternal lineage passed down through generations, provides far too narrow and incomplete a picture to confidently pinpoint one single geographic point of origin for an entire species. This disagreement, playing out openly within scientific journals and conference discussions, illustrates exactly how contested and actively unresolved this broader question genuinely remains within the field today. That kind of open scientific disagreement is not a weakness in the underlying research. It reflects a field still actively working through a genuinely difficult and genuinely important question, using multiple independent lines of evidence, including fossil discoveries, ancient DNA analysis, contemporary genetic patterns, and archaeological artifacts that do not always neatly align with one another, and that require careful, ongoing synthesis before researchers can arrive at anything resembling a fully settled consensus. Resolving these remaining disagreements will likely take additional decades of continued excavation, continued genetic sequencing, and continued careful cross-checking between independent research teams working with different populations, different methods, and sometimes different underlying assumptions about how best to interpret the available evidence. It is worth pausing here to distinguish this African multi-regional model clearly from an older, largely discredited idea, sometimes confused with it, known simply as the multi-regional hypothesis, which proposed decades ago that modern humans evolved independently and roughly simultaneously across multiple continents, including Europe and Asia, from earlier hominin populations already established in those regions. That older global multi-regional idea has been overwhelmingly rejected by the genetic evidence, which clearly shows that modern Homo sapiens evolved specifically within the newer African multi-regional model, operates on an entirely different and considerably more geographically constrained scale, proposing structured during the period leading up to the emergence of fully modern humans, rather than proposing separate, independent human origins, unfolding across entirely different continents. Keeping this distinction clear matters, since conflating the two ideas can create genuine confusion about exactly what current genetic evidence does and does not actually support. What does seem to be gaining broader acceptance across the field, even amid this ongoing disagreement over specific details, is the basic underlying premise that human origins likely did not unfold within one single, geographically confined cradle. Instead, growing evidence increasingly points toward a considerably more distributed process, unfolding simultaneously across multiple regions of Africa, involving semi-isolated populations that periodically connected, exchanged genes and likely cultural knowledge as well, separated again as environmental and climatic conditions shifted across the continent, and gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, converged into the genetically and anatomically modern human population that eventually began spreading beyond Africa entirely. This broader reconsideration has also been shaped by other unexpected fossil discoveries that complicated the traditional narrative in their own distinct ways. In South Africa, researchers exploring the Rising Star cave system uncovered the remains of a previously unknown hominin species named Homo naledi, featuring a puzzling mixture of primitive and surprisingly modern anatomical features. When these remains were eventually dated, They turned out to be remarkably recent, existing somewhere between roughly 235,000 and 335,000 years ago. Discoveries like this reinforce the same broader lesson emerging from the Jebel, Irhoud, and Kalahari findings. Africa during the relevant window of human evolutionary history was not home to a single, simple, linear lineage marching steadily toward modern humanity. It hosted a genuinely complex mosaic of different hominin populations, some more anatomically primitive, some considerably more modern, coexisting, and quite possibly occasionally interacting across various regions of the continent simultaneously. Climate science has added an important supporting piece to this broader picture, helping explain exactly why this kind of distributed, multi-regional pattern makes considerable ecological sense. Africa, during the relevant period spanning roughly the past 300 to 500,000 years, experienced dramatic and repeated climatic fluctuations, cycling between wetter and drier phases as global climate patterns shifted across many thousands of years. During wetter periods, green corridors likely opened up across portions of the continent that are considerably more arid today, allowing populations in different regions to periodically expand their range and come into contact with neighboring groups. During subsequent drier periods, those same populations would have become increasingly isolated from one another again, as previously passable corridors of habitable land contracted or disappeared entirely. This repeated cycle of connection and isolation, driven by a shifting climate over an enormous span of time, offers a genuinely compelling ecological explanation for exactly the kind of genetic patchwork pattern researchers now observe when they carefully study deep population structure among contemporary African populations today. This revised picture carries meaningful implications, extending well beyond simply relocating humanity's birthplace from one region of Africa to another on a map. It fundamentally challenges the entire framing of human origins as a single, linear, point of origin story. Rather than searching for one specific valley, one specific cave system, or one specific ancient population to definitively crown as the true birthplace of our species, researchers increasingly argue that the far more accurate scientific framing treats the entire African continent, in its full geographic breadth, as the collective birthplace of Homo sapiens, with different regions contributing different genetic, cultural, and technological threads that gradually wove together across an enormous span of evolutionary time. This shift also carries an important corrective function within the broader history of the scientific field itself. Earlier 20th century paleoanthropology, shaped considerably by the particular historical circumstances and colonial era, institutional structures under which early excavations were conducted, tended to concentrate research funding, expeditions, and subsequent scholarly attention disproportionately within a small number of well-studied East African sites, while other regions across the continent received comparatively little sustained archaeological investment or attention for decades. This uneven distribution of research effort likely reinforced, and in certain respects likely helped manufacture, an origin narrative that appeared more geographically concentrated than the underlying reality actually was, simply because researchers were looking so intensively in one specific place, while largely neglecting to look nearly as carefully elsewhere. As archaeological investment has gradually expanded into previously understudied regions across Africa in more recent decades, including significant work throughout southern Africa, Morocco, and the broader Maghreb region, and parts of West and Central Africa, the resulting fossil and genetic evidence has begun revealing a considerably fuller and more geographically distributed picture, one that likely more accurately reflects the true underlying complexity of early human evolutionary history, rather than simply reflecting where the 20th century happened to concentrate its excavation efforts most heavily. This expanding research effort has also increasingly involved closer partnership with local African research institutions and scientists, a meaningful shift away from an earlier era in which much of the foundational paleoanthropological work conducted across the continent was led almost exclusively by foreign research teams, often with comparatively limited involvement from local scholars and institutions. Greater investment in African-led research infrastructure, combined with growing access to advanced genetic sequencing and dating technology within African universities and laboratories themselves, has meaningfully expanded the geographic scope of where researchers are now able to search, and correspondingly expanded the range of evidence being uncovered and properly analyzed. This shift represents not just a scientific correction, but also a genuinely important structural one, addressing decades of uneven research investment that likely contributed, in its own quiet way, to the overly narrow origin narrative that dominated public understanding for so long. None of this means the extraordinary East African fossil record suddenly becomes any less scientifically important or any less genuinely remarkable. Sites like Olduvai Gorge and the broader Rift Valley region remain among the most significant and information-rich sources of evidence anywhere on Earth for understanding human evolutionary history, and that status is not being revised or diminished by this broader shift in thinking. What is being revised is the assumption that this exceptionally rich fossil record necessarily represents the singular, exclusive center of the entire human origin story, rather than representing one exceptionally well-preserved and well-studied piece within a considerably larger, more geographically distributed puzzle that researchers are still actively working to fully piece together. This more distributed model also helps resolve a puzzle that had long nagged at researchers working with the traditional East Africa exclusive narrative, namely, why early modern human fossils and archaeological sites scattered elsewhere across the continent, in places like southern Africa's Blomus Cave, kept turning up evidence of remarkably sophisticated symbolic behavior, including deliberately engraved ochre and early shell bead ornamentation at dates that seemed surprisingly early relative to the supposed singular East African point of origin. Under the older single cradle framework, this kind of geographically scattered early sophistication was difficult to fully explain. Under the newer distributed multi-regional framework, it fits far more naturally, since different regional populations across the continent would have been developing their own cultural and technological innovations somewhat independently, occasionally sharing and exchanging ideas as populations periodically reconnected, rather than all innovation necessarily radiating outward from one single original source population. Ancient DNA research has uncovered yet another layer of complexity worth highlighting here, one connected to so-called ghost lineages, archaic hominin populations, known only through their genetic traces within modern African populations, rather than through any directly recovered fossil remains. Researchers analyzing genetic patterns among certain contemporary populations across West and Central Africa have identified segments of DNA that appear to trace back to an unknown, now extinct archaic hominin population that interbred with early modern humans at some point within the past several 100,000 years, despite the fact that no fossil remains belonging to this specific population have ever actually been recovered or identified anywhere. This kind of evidence, sometimes described as detecting a ghost population purely through its lingering genetic signature, offers a striking illustration of exactly how incomplete the fossil record likely remains, and how much of humanity's true evolutionary complexity may currently be invisible to researchers, preserved only faintly within the genomes of living populations today, entirely absent from the physical fossil record altogether. There is a broader and genuinely valuable scientific lesson embedded within this entire story, one that extends well beyond the specific question of human origins itself. Where evidence survives, and where researchers happen to look for it, can quietly and powerfully shape which explanations feel intuitively obvious and settled, regardless of how genuinely complete or accurate the underlying picture those explanations are built upon might actually be. A concentrated cluster of exceptionally well-preserved fossils in one particular region can create a strong scientific and popular impression of geographic exclusivity, even when the true underlying evolutionary story unfolded across a considerably wider and more complex landscape than that single concentrated cluster of evidence alone could ever fully reveal on its own. So when researchers today say we may have been looking for human origins in the wrong place, understand precisely what that claim actually means, and just as importantly, what it carefully does not mean. It does not mean East Africa was somehow irrelevant, or that decades of genuinely important research conducted there should be discarded or dismissed. It means the true story of where our species began was very likely never confined to one single region in the first place, and that the real answer, still gradually coming into focus through ongoing fossil discoveries, ancient DNA research, and deepening genetic analysis across the entire African continent, looks far more like an expansive, interconnected web spanning an entire continent, rather than one single tidy point that could ever be neatly circled on a map and confidently labeled as humanity's one true birthplace. Perhaps that is the most valuable lesson worth carrying away from this entire story, worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. Our species did not begin in one dramatic instant, in one specific valley, cave, or wetland, waiting patiently to be discovered and definitively confirmed by future researchers. We very likely emerged gradually, unevenly, and collectively, woven together across an entire continent's worth of separated and periodically reconnected populations, each one contributing its own genetic and cultural thread to what eventually became all of humanity. The real birthplace of our species, it increasingly appears, was never a single place at all. It was Africa itself in its full and genuinely remarkable geographic entirety, and the closer researchers look, the more that full continental picture continues to reveal.